Well, Professor Yule, thank you for joining us today. Perhaps we could start our conversation with the notion that some people consider that children really can't have PTSD. Is that still the case? And if so, how young can you begin to think about children having PTSD?
Well, I think that many parents and teachers are very reluctant to think that some traumatic event has an effect on their kids. And they would prefer to think that there was not a disorder. We've known for, a century really, that parents and teachers are not very good at picking up anxiety problems in kids. They can report conduct problems, but less anxiety. And it turns out that they're even worse at reporting on traumatic stress reactions. They tend not to want to talk to the kids after a disaster in case it makes them more upset, and they don't ask them what's going on inside your head. So that in 1980, when the APA recognized PTSD for the first time, there were various things said about that probably children and adolescents didn't develop it. 1987, in DSM-3R, they were beginning to see that there were some adolescents who did develop it. And that was the year that I got involved after the sinking of the cross-channel car ferry, the Herald of Free Enterprise, and being totally ignorant, as I often am, I didn't know that children weren't supposed to get this. And I did what I was trying to do, which was take a history from the parents and then sit down with the child and talk and ask them to tell me. And they poured out all the reactions that were by then recognized as traumatic stress reactions in adults. And at the same time, my good friend Bob Pinus was doing similarly in the States. And we just went and asked kids. Prior to that, the studies that had been looked at had mainly relied on parent report or teacher report, and so they missed it. So from 1987 onwards, things really changed radically. 93, it so happened, both Bob Pinus and I were recruited by UNICEF to work in former Yugoslavia to see what could be done to help the kids affected by war. And so my life, both professionally and personally, was changed radically in 1987. And we've been studying the effects of trauma on kids, and as importantly, more importantly, working hard to develop ways of treating that. And that's where we are today. But it still is the case that there are people who are reluctant to consider that the traumatic event will cause some harm to the children. And indeed, as we talk right now, Sandy McFarlane is talking about the adult effects of trauma in childhood and showing that what to some people would have been a relatively scary but not terribly interesting traumatic event actually has very long-term consequences. So that it's no longer the case that we can dismiss the development of PTSD in childhood. And how young it goes, very difficult to know because of the methodologies that we have. We know a lot about 7-year-olds and upwards, and that's partly because you can get these 7-year-olds to report things in writing. You can use questionnaires. That's quick, dirty, and cheap. Mm-hmm. If you're going to get very young kids and you require individual clinical interviews, and even more so with terribly young ones, direct and structured observations, that is expensive and is rarely done. So there are isolated cases of trauma in pre-verbal children and the long-term effects that can have, but we don't know nearly enough. And indeed, as I think most people in ESCAP would agree, the bulk of the governments do not resource work with children nearly as much as they do with adults, and so it's quite shocking.
You said in 1993, I believe, your life changed both professionally and by virtue of your work on trauma in children.
87 when I got involved, yes. But
Can you tell me how it changed personally?
Personally, our own kids were pretty young, and they quickly picked up that disasters meant I might get involved. And it used to be that the evening news would go on, and I'd hear a yell, "Dad, there's been another trauma," and I'm supposed to rush off at my white Charger and do something. And that quickly, it was impossible. I remember the summer after the Herald of Free Enterprise ferry disaster, which was partly caused by the bow doors remaining open and a small amount of water making the ferry unstable. We were crossing in our annual holiday to France, and I was not going down into the bowels of that ship. I was out on deck the whole time. And my then 7-year-old son came up and said to me, "Daddy, how do they know the doors are closed?" Now, we had never realized, and we'd never spoken to them about the detail of what had happened. They'd picked it up. And kids pick up these things, pick up these cues. And again, that just feeds into knowing or realizing how much children are sensitive to adults' behavior.
So what you're suggesting is the mechanism may be partly through their own direct experience, but it may also be a reflection of experiences of others?
I think that in terms of, if you like, secondary traumatization, or putting it more specifically, the way in which they understand what's going on, yes, that they can get that from the adults and others around them.
Now, what do you suspect, at least where we are today, is the mechanism underlying it? What do you think happens, if you were to speculate at this point?
Well, I think that quite interesting, and certainly at this meeting has been brought right to my attention in a way. From two different theoretical perspectives, they came out with a very similar main message. You've got the cognitive psychologists moved in, and the work of particularly Edna Foe in the States, David Clark and Anke Ellis in the UK, was showing that it was the trauma memories that are the purveyor, if you like, of the distress. And indeed, Clark and Ellis would argue that PTSD should no longer be considered an anxiety disorder, that is a memory disorder. And they've got a very elegant argument about that. So that the focus is on how the current misinterpretations in the traumatic memory are driving the distress and preventing a naturalistic, where it's resolving. On the other direction, again, Sandy McFarlane's done a very elegant series of presentations from a neurobiological perspective. And what comes through from there is that using a large number of neurological and fMRI and so on, they're being able to show that, again, it's trauma memory. And that his argument being that when a traumatic memory is fired off, and then fired off again by triggers, then what happened as just a happenstance in terms of the memory path becomes permanent. And then, far from inoculating you against the next trauma, it actually speeds it up. And so by the time you have your fourth trauma in life, you've got problems. Memory. And how then we deal with that, how we can face up to the fact that there are permanent changes at a psychophysiological, neurobiological level, and yet we can rehabilitate and we can overcome those, but they're still there.
So, while we have very little time at the moment, just could you briefly tell us, given that framework of causality, what are the elements of treatment that seem to be the most powerful, the most important?
Well, we've known for a long time that reliving can be helpful, but in naive hands, if you just get a naive therapist asking someone to relive it, and they then come out with horrendous memories, it's all too easy for the therapist to say, okay, we'll stop there. And they've left the person in a dreadful state. We know that you need prolonged exposure if you're going to do that. We know that you need to look and listen very carefully to the words that they use to describe what's happening, and then to challenge the misinterpretations, and there can be many. And so it's a mixture of reliving in a secure environment with someone who's sympathetic, who is going to challenge you to relook at things and reconstrue them. And we now have evidence from our recent longitudinal studies of very young kids, where we used a post-traumatic cognitions inventory, picking up misattributions and so on, within 2 weeks of a traumatic event. Kids who score high on misattributions were the ones who were very high risk of developing PTSD. So that's beginning to show we're looking at a process, not a symptom. And then in our recently published randomized control trial, again, we used this post-traumatic cognitions inventory before and after. And of course, they all had PTSD before, they all had many, many misattributions. After treatment, those are normalized. So that together with an earlier study on use of the emotional stoop task is showing that we're beginning to get a handle on the process. And that process is funny memories, traumatic memories that are misattributing, which can be corrected.
So then the fundamental element of treatment is to go in and try to provide an alternative memory pathway that then the individual could use.
Indeed, and to tackle any of the other almost secondary things like concentration and poor sleep disorder and so on. But we know about those, yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. It sounds like a lot has happened in a short period of time. It must be quite a thrill to have been a central part of that over the past 20 years.
I never thought of myself as being a central part, but it's been a very, very exciting and worthwhile journey, so yes.
Well, I think you've very much been a central part, and you've certainly been wonderful today. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.